2 nights ago, I was talking about voter ID being racist. And that is a conversation we're seeing a lot, right? We've got all these voter laws that are being passed, restrictions or regulations, and there's a lot of chatter right now about this, all these voter laws being suppression, forms of voter suppression, or being racist in some form. A lot of chatter going on about that right now. And, like with recently the Georgia laws that were passed, and then Mitch McConnell comes out and tells when the corporations started to kind of push back and said, we're moving, we're against these laws. We're moving stuff out of Georgia. We're out of Atlanta and all this. And then Mitch McConnell comes out and says, well, corporations should not be involved in politics. And it's like, really, Mitch? Because that's where you're getting all your money. That's where you're getting all your money. And so now Mitch McConnell retracted his statements. He walked him back today and he says, well, maybe I didn't say that so eloquently. He says, actually, what did Mitch McConnell say exactly? He said, quote, I didn't say that very artfully yesterday. He says he told reporters that corporations they're certainly entitled to be involved in politics. He says, my complaint about the CEOs is they ought to read the damn bill, says Mitch McConnell. So he's walking it back because he's realizing, wait a minute, I do get all of my money from corporations. And remember that whole Citizens United thing that Republicans were all for, saying that corporations are people too, and that they're allowed to to spend endless amounts of money in politics and engage in politics because politics affect them. And so then Mitch McConnell comes out and says, stay out of politics. And he says, oh, wait, no, okay, hold on. I don't want to be a hypocrite. And so he is walking back those statements. This is sort of what I've been talking about a bit when it comes to watching the Republican Party and seeing what they're doing. Democrats have fortified themselves. There was that moment, there was that blimp in time when Bernie Sanders rose up in 2016. He was a real threat to Hillary Clinton. The Democratic establishment couldn't believe what was going on in front of their eyes, and they squashed it. They said, forget that, that's not happening. But the Bernie train moved forward after 2016. And then AOC was elected in 2018. And they saw, wow, this is genuinely a deeper threat than we thought. We thought Bernie would just kind of go away and people would forget about him. And people didn't. And then 2020 comes along and Bernie Sanders was undoubtedly the most popular candidate going into the primary. And so the Democratic establishment rolled out, a clown car of candidates. It was one right after the other just to challenge Bernie Sanders. And ultimately, in the end, one of the least popular candidates ends up getting the nomination and selecting the least popular candidate for his vice presidency. So the Democratic establishment got their claws back in and said, over our dead bodies, we're not going to allow for this populist uprising to take over the Democratic establishment. So they fortified. They've got Joe in there. Joe is going to restore everything to the Obama era, and then he's going to hand over everything to Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is going to take over. She's going to have she's going to hope to have 2 terms. So they're looking at 12 years, hopefully, of Democratic control. Not sure if they're going to get that. They're going to aim for it, though. And so they fortified. So then now it's all eyes on the Republican Party. And a lot of people are having a hard time shifting their minds on this, right? Because we've been programmed for so long, for decades now, to think that the Republicans, those who are progressives, some of you are Republicans and you're watching, so you're not really thinking like this, but maybe you have these thoughts about Democrats. But we do have this conditioning, this programming, like a political party is somehow a birthright, or like family, or our tribe. And really, it's just politics. And you should be every election, you should be reassessing where you stand. You shouldn't really be a Democrat or a Republican. You shouldn't join anything. What you should be instead is an American who votes, and you look at all the issues and you decide to vote based on what you think is right for the time. And things shift and things change and parties change, and they've changed numerous times in the past. And now we're watching possibly that change happen again with that Republican Party. It looks like that Republican Party is changing in a direction that, I'm not going to lie, I really like. I'm starting to look at it thinking, I could imagine if things continue on the way they are and as rapidly as they are in 4 years, I might be a Republican. I might be aligning way more with Republicans than I do with Democrats because Republicans have morphed so much as they've kind of adopted what their base is wanting them to adopt. And I do think one of those things is corporations staying out of politics. I think that's an interesting shift that we're seeing happen inside the Republican Party. You know, we've seen other shifts happen lately, right? We've seen this, the cancel culture that affected Republicans so deeply, and this sort of censoring people that have different opinions from you. Suddenly, you know, after years of Republicans being the ones saying, oh, I don't agree with you, you should be silenced. You shouldn't be on TV. People shouldn't hear you, you know, stay in the closet, right? For years, decades, Republicans were they were that way. And suddenly now that they're the ones under attack, they say, wait a minute, we should be regulating these social media companies, you know, not all this free for all, whatever, companies can do whatever they want. No, now Republicans are saying, wait a minute, maybe we should regulate these guys. You've got Thomas Clarence, the most conservative justice on the bench, saying, oh, I think social media companies should be public utilities. These are things that those of us who identified previously, I don't really as much anymore because the term has changed, identified as progressives are like, yeah, these are the things we've been saying. We've been saying that social media is a public utility. We've been saying that we need to strengthen voter laws, that we need to call out corruption in the voting systems, that maybe they're not exactly always on the up and up. And that is something that progressives have been calling out for years. And progressives have been saying corporations should stay out of politics. They're there for jobs. The politics are for the people. And people work at corporations. You've got CEOs. They get a vote, too, when it comes to politics. And the janitor gets a vote. Everybody gets a vote. And a lot of people, of course, they're going to want to keep their job. So they're going to vote in a way, oftentimes, that is going to allow them to keep their job, which would by proxy benefit a lot of these corporations. So you don't need the corporation to be its own entity on its own. The people that are working there, the people that are running it are going to be doing a lot of that just naturally out of self-preservation. So now it's interesting, though, that when we see these corporations and we're starting to see more and more of them sort of take this, cultural, they take up the cultural war issue and they get involved in the culture wars. Now we're going to see more and more Republicans saying, wait a minute, you shouldn't be involved in politics. You guys are messing with livelihoods. You guys are messing with the way things should function because you're morally against something. And so you're going to hightail it out of a place. Because, so we're seeing this shift happening. And even though Mitch McConnell walked back his statements today, I don't think a lot of Republicans that are feeling that way have walked back their feelings. I think there's still quite a few Republicans, the new populist Republicans, who are actually saying, you know what, Mitch? No, corporations should actually be staying out of this. Hollywood should stay out of it. Corporations should stay out of it. Leave these issues to the people. Another thing that I'm seeing a shift of with the Republican Party is, we saw that the young Republicans of New York were the ones that did this Occupy Wall Street recently over the GameStop fiasco. So they were saying, wait a minute, we need to regulate Wall Street. I mean, look, we're in topsy-turvy, upside-down world. I don't know what is going on. And yes, the Republican Party in my book has really a long ways to go before the Republican Party morphs into something that I would consider to be more aligned with myself and my political leanings or progressive in some way, or because I do think they're moving in a Teddy Roosevelt almost progressive Republican direction. But I see the path possibly going in that direction. And I'm welcoming it. I'm all for it. There's a lot of stuff with the Republican Party that I'd like to throw out. That I still think Republicans are still trying to control morality. We saw this just happen yesterday in Arkansas, where the Arkansas legislature decided that they wanted to regulate what parents, medical treatments for children that parents want to give or want to allow doctors to do on their children. I understand that it's a hot debate, but nonetheless, we still see that morality coming in. People saying, well, I want to control you based on my morals, and your morals are wrong and my morals are right, and you're going to do what I say because I'm more morally superior than you. We need to really drop that. And if Republicans can drop that, one thing in my home state of Idaho, for example, the Republicans that run the state there, as much as they claim to be libertarians and all for freedoms, they want to enshrine in the Idaho Constitution that marijuana can never be legalized. And in the state of Idaho, you can't buy liquor unless it's from a state-run liquor store because, state wants to control and make money. I'm sure that has a lot to do with it now, but a lot of it began with morality. We want to control your consumption because I know better than you. Let me be your nanny. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of bring that up. That I'm interested in this shift that's happening. I'm interested in the morphing of the Republican Party. I see more and more characters coming out of the Republican Party rising up, kind of speaking and going in that direction. And of course, so they're not all, people are flawed and then they dig up crap about that person or whatever. But nonetheless, I think Ron DeSantis, I'm really interested in seeing what Ron DeSantis's political future is. And, there's others, I believe, that are coming to the forefront that are making change in that party. And I think it's overdue. And I would like to have the choice of between, political options that I don't want it to be just so I'm all this one way and I hate that other side. We need to sort of correct that a bit. And I think this metamorphosis is going to help. Okay, so going back to voter suppression and whether or not voter IDs are racist. One thing that I asked on the show was, if you could explain to me why a voter ID is racist, I want to hear from you, because I genuinely had a difficult time understanding exactly how it's racist. So I keep hearing that narrative, and I could just accept that narrative and say, well, then it's racist. And this is what most people do. I think most people turn on CNN or MSNBC, and then they say, they said that this is racist. These are voter suppression tactics, and they're racist. And so then I'm against it. And they don't really know why. They don't have like an actual logical line of thinking to go down to say this is why exactly it's racist. They just hear it and they go with it. And I think a lot of times politicians and the media bank on that. They want us to just not think, and they want us to just agree because we heard it. So we were told it was racist. We were told it was voter suppression. And we all said, okay, then we don't want that. It's wrong. We're against it, right? But of course, that's not how I think. And I wanted to know, somebody please explain to me, because it seems almost logical to me, right? That, well, if you're going to vote, you would show an ID. What is exactly wrong with that? Somebody explain. So I got a really great email from a viewer named Adam. And he wrote that the reason to not require voter ID is related to preventing people from voting because they're unable to pay for an ID or a driver's license, or the failure of being able to acquire the documents to support them getting an ID. These are all the hurdles and burden to vote. He says, we outlawed what was once called a poll tax. Poll taxes are exactly what they sound like they are, the requirement to pay in order to be able to cast a vote in the election. If you could not pay the fee, you could not vote. Poll taxes are unconstitutional. This is foundational. So that makes a lot of sense to me. You should not have to pay to vote at all, right? And it shouldn't even be a dollar or anything. You shouldn't have any hurdle when it comes to finances to vote. Now, there were times in this country where they said, well, you had to be a landowner, a white landowner or whatever, in order to vote. I don't even know. Did you have to be a white landowner, or did you just have to be a landowner? But nonetheless, they put all these provisions in there that you had to have XYZ in order to vote. And we've over time have opened up voting to everyone. It used to be maybe white landowners or landowners in general, or then it was just men, or maybe there was a test and you had to be able to read. And then they finally allowed women to vote, right? So we've opened up voting slowly. And because we haven't always had a country where you could just vote, everybody could vote no matter what, and it's always been a free country, and it hasn't historically been that way, I think that it stands to reason that we might want to look at some of our voting habits or requirements that do then ultimately prevent people from voting. And I could tell you that a voter ID is, I have been prevented from voting plenty of times that had nothing to do with an ID. So let's talk about this. So they're saying poll taxes. Okay, you can't require somebody to pay. Getting an ID requires, let's say, a birth certificate. It costs you money to then have to go and acquire your birth certificate in order to get this ID. So then obviously you would say, well, then why don't we just give out free IDs, right? A universal ID. Well, that would work, I think, as long as states, and many states that do require the voter ID, if they require an identification to vote, then you would get your identification for free. It's something that they issue to you. Now, in other countries, my good friend who happens to be staying with me, Katya from Russia, was explaining to me that in Russia, they all have what they call domestic passports, essentially. It's a passport. So they have international passports that allow them to travel all around the world. But then they have a domestic passport in Russia that is automatically issued to you at the age of 14. So you're given this identification at 14, and then you're given that identification again at 20. They retake the photograph at 20. And then they do it again at about 45, and then they do it again at 60. So your picture changes because you age and stuff and gain weight and all those things. So and she says that in Russia, you have to carry this document with you all the time. And it's not a driver's license. It's not a passport for international travel. It's just a document that identifies who you are. So I believe when I was growing up that the state of Idaho required, I might be mistaken on this, but I thought the state of Idaho required, if you weren't going to get a driver's license at 18, you had to get a state identification card at 18, and that you did have to carry around your identification card everywhere you went. So if a cop stopped you, they could identify you. Or if you fell sick and you were going to the hospital, they could identify you. Whenever I go on a run, for example, I always make sure I tuck my driver's license in my running pants, because what if I collapse, right? And somebody needs to identify who I am. So she was saying that is what they do. And many other countries do this. They issue automatically, just by virtue of being an American citizen or a citizen of their country, they automatically issue you an identification. So same thing like birth certificates, for example, or social security cards. These don't cost you anything to be issued. So we have already a system of issuing documents that is free, and everybody gets one. That if you're an American citizen, you automatically get a social security card. The only way you maybe wouldn't get a birth certificate, I suppose, is if you were born at home and you never went and told the doctors. I'm not exactly sure how it works with home births, but I would imagine, you'd have I guess then that would be the only situation where maybe you wouldn't be automatically issued a birth certificate. But it seems to me that it would be easy enough to say, okay, if you're an American citizen, by virtue of being an American citizen, the moment you hit 18, you automatically receive an identification, a federal identification like a social security card or a birth certificate. Maybe the federal government wants to leave it up to the states to issue, and they say that it's got to be done state by state. But really, it should be something done on the federal level, the same thing as a social security card, because you might move from state to state, but you would have this American ID, not your California ID, not your Idaho ID or your Texas ID, but you'd get your American ID, which is what my friend was saying goes on in Russia. She gets her Russian ID, and then she has her driver's license and maybe her, local community type thing, but she's got her Russian identification. So Adam says the solution to this problem of voter ID being what they call racist, and saying, well, this doesn't allow certain people that are really, really poor, then they can't go and get their birth certificate because they don't have an extra $15, and then maybe they can't read, maybe they have a difficult time using the internet, there's all of these hurdles, and then so it's voter suppression because those people are not able to get the documents they need in order to acquire this ID for a variety of reasons. So he says the solution to get everybody on board is universal voter registration and universal ID cards. And that if we just issued those and did that for free, then yes, we could have everybody show an identification in order to vote, or give their voter ID card number or their American ID card number put on for the vote by mail, that sort of thing. That to me makes a lot of sense. Why can't we just do that? Why can't we just issue why can't we have universal voter registration? So the minute you turn 18, if you have a social security number, you should just be registered to vote. It's that simple. Automatically, your social security number transitions into the ability, voting. It's like a voter registration ID. I don't understand why that is so difficult. We issue social security numbers to every American. And once you become an American, you get one. So you're getting one by birth, or you get one when you become an American citizen. I don't understand why we can't just automatically transition that into now you're registered to vote. That way, if you move around a lot, and this is where I experienced personally voter suppression. For me, there were years I couldn't vote. It was because I was working in radio. We moved a lot. So I never had the proper, really, interestingly enough, identification in order to vote. When these people say, oh, well, it's voter suppression, a lot of California liberals are screaming about Georgia voter suppression or screaming about the idea of a voter ID. But I'll tell you what, registering to vote in California is not easy. You have to have an address. So what do homeless people do? They say, well, there's workarounds for them. Really? How are you going to get them educated about the workarounds? How do they know? If you do vote by mail, how is that not voter suppression for homeless people? How is that not the same issue? You're alienating people that don't have homes, or you're alienating people who are kind of moving around a lot. Maybe they're staying with friends. Maybe they move from one place to another a lot, or they move from out of state, and then you're not allowed to vote. And that has been my problem over numerous election cycles. I have a tendency to move around a lot. I've always moved a lot for whatever reason. I don't know. And it's been difficult for me to register to vote every single time. They send maybe my voter registration, my ballot to the wrong address. They won't allow me to register for vote because I don't have the right identification proving that I'm a resident of that state. There's a lot of hurdles to this. So they act like having a voter ID is somehow a hurdle, and I don't understand how it's any more of a hurdle than anything else. It doesn't make logical sense to me. And I think there's plenty of other hurdles for people to vote that I don't see. I don't know how the pot can call the kettle black. These like liberal Californians, for example, that are preventing me from being able to vote because I moved to a new address. And then they say, well, you can easily just go online and register. Well, what if you don't have internet? There's always these what if you don't have something. So the solution, obviously, I think, is universal voter registration, universal ID cards. If we get on board with that, and we say, look, you automatically at the age of 18, your social security number transitions into a voter ID number. And you're also issued a new type of social security card that has your photograph on it. And that is what you carry around. And you have that when you're 14, maybe, and you get it again at 18, and then you get it again at 40, and you get it again at 60. Why is that such a problem? I don't know, guys. I have no idea. But now I'm taking on right-wing talking points, so because I don't understand why it's such a terrible idea or why it's a problem. I do think that it obviously does prevent people who are not American citizens from voting, and that is fine with me. That's part of being an American citizen is your right to vote in America. That is what you get when you're an American citizen. If you're not an American citizen, you